Hey there, weary souls and restless minds. Tonight, we're taking a journey back through the dusty corridors of time to a place where life moved slower, smelled worse, and ended much, much sooner than you'd probably prefer. This is boring history for sleep, where we explore the gritty, uncomfortable realities of the past in the most soothing way possible. So before you settle into your comfortable bed with your temperature-controlled room and your unlimited access to clean water, take a moment to appreciate just how incredibly soft your life really is. Because tonight, we're asking a simple question that might just change how you see your daily complaints forever. What if you woke up tomorrow in medieval Europe, not as a king, not as a knight in shining armor, not even as a merchant with a decent cottage, just you, exactly as you are right now, dropped into the year 1347 with nothing but the clothes on your back and a growing realization that everything you know about survival is completely useless? Would you last a single day? Would you make it through one medieval morning without longing for the sweet embrace of your modern problems? The answer, if we're being honest, is probably not, and that's exactly what makes this so fascinating to explore as we drift toward sleep. You see, when most people think about medieval times, they picture something romantic. Stone castles silhouetted against dramatic skies, brave knights rescuing fair maidens, bustling marketplaces filled with colorful characters straight out of a fairy tale. Maybe a few wise monks copying beautiful manuscripts by candlelight. It's all very atmospheric and appealing, especially when you're stressed about your Wi-Fi being slow or your coffee taking too long to brew. But here's the thing about history. The further back you go, the more you realize that almost everything we consider normal, comfortable, or even basically human would have been impossible luxuries to our ancestors. The gap between your current life and medieval life isn't just a matter of technology. It's a chasm so wide that crossing it would probably kill you within hours. Let's start with something simple. This morning, you probably woke up in a bed, not just any bed, but a carefully engineered sleep system with springs, padding, temperature regulation, and fabric softer than anything a medieval king could have imagined. You opened your eyes in a room that was exactly the temperature you wanted it to be, protected from wind, rain, insects, and the dozens of things that might want to eat you during the night. Within minutes of waking up, you probably did something that would have seemed like magic to a medieval person. You walked a few steps and turned a handle, and clean, drinkable water came pouring out of a metal tube. Not only was it clean, but it was exactly the temperature you wanted. Hot water, on demand, any time of day or night. No walking to a well, no boiling, no worrying about whether it might kill you. Then you probably cleaned yourself with soap. Actual soap, designed specifically for human skin, scented with pleasant fragrances, formulated to be gentle and effective. You used this miracle substance casually, probably without thinking about it, possibly while listening to music that was being transmitted through the air from thousands of miles away. After that, you got dressed in clothes that were machine-woven from materials gathered from around the world, stitched together by machines so precise they could create seams stronger than anything a medieval tailor could produce by hand. Your most casual outfit represents more technological sophistication than entire medieval kingdoms possessed. And then you ate breakfast, food that was transported from hundreds or thousands of miles away, preserved using methods that would have seemed like alchemy, prepared using tools and techniques that didn't exist for most of human history. You probably threw some of it away without thinking twice. This is just the first hour of your day. Before you even fully woke up, you'd already experienced more comfort, convenience, and luxury than most medieval people would see in their entire lives. But let's imagine you wake up instead on a pile of straw in a single-room hut that you share with your extended family and possibly some livestock. The walls are made of mud, sticks, and hope. There are gaps everywhere. It's cold, it's damp, and something is definitely crawling on you. Your blanket is made of rough wool that smells like the sheep it came from, assuming you're lucky enough to have a blanket at all. The first thing you'd notice is the smell. Medieval life had a very distinctive aroma, and it wasn't pleasant. It was a combination of unwashed bodies, animal waste, rotting food, smoke from fires that never quite burned clean, and the general mustiness of a world where nothing ever really got clean. You'd also notice the sounds, not the gentle hum of air conditioning or the distant whoosh of traffic. Instead, you'd hear roosters crowing, pigs grunting, people coughing with illnesses that would be easily treatable today, and the general cacophony of a world where privacy and quiet were unimaginable luxuries. But the real shock would come when you tried to do any of the simple things you take for granted. Need to use the bathroom? There isn't one. There's a hole in the ground outside, assuming you're lucky. More likely there's just a general area where people go, and it's not pleasant. No toilet paper, no privacy, no hand soap afterward. Just you, the elements, and the growing realization that dignity is apparently a modern invention. Hungry? Hope you like porridge. Medieval peasants ate a lot of porridge, made from whatever grains they could grow or afford, usually barley or oats, sometimes mixed with vegetables if they were available. It wasn't seasoned much because spices were incredibly expensive. Salt was a luxury. Sugar didn't exist in Europe yet. Your medieval breakfast would be a gray, lumpy mixture that tasted like wet cardboard and had the texture of paste. Want some fruit? Only if it's in season and grown locally. Want some meat? Only if you're wealthy or it's a special occasion. Most medieval people ate meat a few times a year at most. Fish was more common if you lived near water, but it was usually salted or dried, which made it about as appetizing as shoe leather. And speaking of shoes, yours probably wouldn't fit the medieval world very well. Most people went barefoot most of the time. Shoes were expensive, difficult to make, and wore out quickly. The ones that existed were basically pieces of leather wrapped around your feet and tied on. No support, no cushioning, no protection from sharp objects or harsh weather. This is all just the beginning of your day, and already you'd be facing challenges that would make your worst Monday morning look like a spa retreat. But it gets worse, much worse. See, the thing about medieval life is that it wasn't just uncomfortable. It was dangerous, in ways that are hard for us to comprehend. Everything could kill you. The water could kill you. The food could kill you. A small cut could kill you. Childbirth could kill you. A cold could kill you. Other people could kill you, often for reasons that seem trivial today. Life expectancy was somewhere around 30 to 40 years, if you were lucky. Many people didn't make it past childhood. Those who did survive to adulthood often bore the marks of a hard life. Missing teeth, scars from accidents or violence, bent backs from constant manual labor, hands gnarled from work that modern machines do for us now. And yet somehow, people not only survived, but built the foundations of the world we live in today. They created art, literature, music, and architecture that still moves us centuries later. They developed systems of law, government, and social organization that influenced everything that came after. They were fully human, just like us, with the same hopes, dreams, fears, and desires. They fell in love, raised families, told jokes, celebrated holidays, and found ways to create meaning and joy, even in circumstances that would break most of us. They were remarkably resilient, incredibly resourceful, and often quite clever about solving the problems their world presented. But they were also living in a world that was fundamentally hostile to human comfort and longevity, a world where survival required constant vigilance, backbreaking work, and a kind of toughness that most of us simply don't possess anymore. This is what makes medieval history so fascinating and, in its own way, so relaxing to contemplate as we drift off to sleep. It's a reminder of how far we've come, how much we have to be grateful for, and how the simple act of lying in a comfortable bed in a safe room is actually a kind of miracle. Tonight, as we explore the gritty realities of medieval life, let yourself sink into the comfort of your modern existence. Feel the softness of your mattress, the warmth of your blankets, the security of your walls. Listen to the gentle hum of your heating system, the distant sound of cars on safe, well-maintained roads, the quiet efficiency of a world that works so well you usually don't even notice it. Because understanding the past isn't just about learning facts and dates. It's about gaining perspective on the present, appreciating the countless small miracles that make up our daily lives, and maybe sleeping a little better, knowing that your biggest problem tomorrow probably won't be finding clean water or avoiding the plague. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's take a slow, detailed journey through a world that was harder, stranger, and more unforgiving than most of us can imagine. A world where your modern sensibilities, your contemporary knowledge, and your 21st century expectations would be not just useless, but potentially fatal. Let's continue our journey by examining what would happen when you tried to navigate the social world of medieval Europe. Because surviving the physical challenges was only half the battle. The other half was understanding a complex web of social rules, religious obligations, and cultural expectations that could get you killed just as quickly as drinking bad water. Imagine trying to have a conversation with a medieval person. You open your mouth and immediately reveal yourself as something impossible, something that doesn't belong. Your accent would be wrong. Your vocabulary would be filled with words that don't exist yet and missing words that are essential. Your grammar would mark you as foreign. But foreign from where? No place on earth in 1347 produces people who talk like you. But it's not just the language. It's everything about how you communicate. You're used to looking people in the eye when you talk to them. In medieval Europe, that could be seen as aggressive, disrespectful, or dangerously presumptuous, depending on who you're talking to. There's a rigid hierarchy governing every social interaction, and you don't know the rules. You don't know how to bow properly, or when to bow, or to whom. You don't know the difference between a lord, a knight, a freeman, and a serf. Just by looking at them, you don't know which roads you're allowed to travel on, which fields you can walk through, which streams you can drink from. Every piece of land belongs to someone, and that someone has the right to punish trespassers in ways that would horrify you. You also don't know how to pray properly, and this is a serious problem. Medieval Europe was intensely, overwhelmingly Christian, but not the kind of Christianity you might be familiar with. This was a world where religious observance wasn't optional or personal. It was mandatory, public, and constantly monitored by your neighbors. You'd be expected to know the prayers, the rituals, the calendar of saints' days and holy observances. You'd need to know when to fast, how to fast, what constitutes breaking a fast. You'd need to understand the difference between mortal sins and venial sins, know which saints to invoke for which problems, understand the proper way to confess your sins to a priest, And speaking of sins, almost everything you consider normal behavior would be considered sinful in medieval Europe. The way you dress, the way you walk, the way you laugh, the topics you want to discuss, your attitudes toward authority, work, marriage, death, and suffering. You'd be constantly, inadvertently, offending people in ways you couldn't understand. Let's say you somehow manage to avoid immediate social catastrophe and find yourself in need of work, because you'll need to eat and you'll need shelter, and both of those things require either money or the goodwill of others. What kind of work could you actually do? Most medieval work required skills you don't have and physical capabilities you probably haven't developed. Farming wasn't just planting seeds and waiting for them to grow. It was an incredibly complex system of knowledge passed down through generations, involving understanding of soil types, weather patterns, crop rotation, animal husbandry, and seasonal timing that could mean the difference between eating and starving. You'd need to know how to handle oxen and horses, how to maintain and repair tools that were made by hand and couldn't be easily replaced. You'd need to understand which plants were edible, which were medicinal, which were poisonous. You'd need the physical strength and endurance to work from dawn to dusk, doing backbreaking labor with primitive tools. Maybe you think you could be a craftsman instead, but medieval crafts were guild-controlled monopolies that required years of apprenticeship to enter. You couldn't just decide to be a blacksmith or a carpenter or a weaver. These were closed societies with their own rules, their own secrets, their own ways of excluding outsiders. Even if you somehow convinced someone to take you on as an apprentice, you'd be starting at the very bottom, doing the most menial tasks for years, while learning skills that required not just knowledge, but muscle memory developed over decades. Your hands would be soft and clumsy compared to people who had been working with their hands their entire lives. And throughout all of this, you'd be dealing with constant physical discomfort that would gradually wear down your mental resilience. The cold would be unlike anything you've experienced, because medieval buildings were drafty, poorly heated, and designed more to keep the rain out than to maintain comfortable temperatures. You'd be dirty in ways that would make you constantly self-conscious. Your clothes would smell, your hair would be greasy, your skin would be grimy, and there wouldn't be much you could do about it. Bathing was considered unhealthy by many people. Soap was expensive and harsh, and privacy for personal hygiene was non-existent. You'd be hungry most of the time, not starving necessarily, but never quite satisfied. The food would be repetitive, bland, and often partially spoiled. Your body would crave nutrients it wasn't getting, sugars and fats and proteins that were rare luxuries. You'd be surrounded by sounds and smells that would assault your senses constantly. The noise of animals, the stench of human and animal waste, the smoke from fires, the sounds of people living in close quarters with no acoustic privacy. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of medieval life would be the constant awareness of mortality. Death wasn't hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes. It was everywhere, visible, immediate, and often violent. You'd see people die from things that are easily treatable today. You'd watch children waste away from diseases, women die in childbirth, men succumb to infected wounds. You'd live with the knowledge that you could die at any moment, from causes completely outside your control. A bad harvest could mean starvation. A wet season could bring disease. A political conflict could bring soldiers who would take your food, burn your house, and kill you if you resisted. This constant proximity to death would change how you thought about everything. Your priorities, your fears, your hopes, your relationships. You couldn't plan for the future the way you do now, because the future was so uncertain. You couldn't invest in long-term goals because you might not live to see them accomplished. And yet, as we sink deeper into our comfortable beds, surrounded by the gentle hum of modern life, there's something almost peaceful about imagining this simpler, if harsher world. A world where the problems were immediate and concrete, rather than abstract and endless, where your success or failure depended on your own hands and back, rather than on complex systems you can't control or understand. Medieval people didn't worry about their credit scores, or their social media presence, or whether they were fulfilling their potential. They worried about having enough food for winter, about keeping their children alive, about not angering their lord, or their neighbors, or their God. Their concerns were basic, human, and in some ways more honest than ours. They lived closer to the fundamental realities of existence, the eternal questions of survival, meaning, and mortality that we spend so much energy trying to avoid thinking about. So as you drift toward sleep tonight, let yourself imagine the weight of that medieval blanket, scratchy and thin but precious, because it's all you have. Feel the hard surface beneath you, the cold air on your face, the knowledge that tomorrow will bring work that will exhaust your body, and challenges that will test your spirit, and then sink back into your modern comfort, your soft sheets and perfect temperature, your security and safety, and appreciate the miracle of this moment, this life, this extraordinary time to be alive. Because while you're contemplating the harsh realities of medieval existence, let's delve deeper into something that would challenge everything you think you know about basic human needs. Let's talk about what it really meant to be hungry in medieval times. You see, when we say we're hungry today, we usually mean we're ready for our next meal, maybe feeling a bit peckish, perhaps experiencing that familiar rumble that reminds us it's time to eat. But medieval hunger was something entirely different. It was a constant companion, a gnawing presence that colored every thought and decision. Medieval people lived in a state that nutritionists today would classify as chronic malnutrition, not starvation exactly, but a persistent state of not having enough. Their bodies were smaller than ours, not just because of genetics, but because they simply didn't have access to the calories and nutrients needed for optimal growth and development. A typical medieval peasant consumed maybe 1,500 calories a day when times were good. When times were bad, which was often, that number could drop to barely 1,000. For comparison, modern dietary guidelines suggest that most adults need between 2,000 and 2,500 calories daily just to maintain their current weight. But it wasn't just the quantity of food that would shock you. It was the complete absence of variety. Imagine eating the same grain porridge for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, day after day, week after week, season after season. Maybe with some cabbage thrown in if you were lucky. Maybe a bit of cheese on feast days. The concept of eating for pleasure, of having favorite foods, of dietary preferences, simply didn't exist for most people. Your medieval diet would be overwhelmingly brown and beige. Brown bread, if you could afford wheat. More likely, darker bread made from barley, oats, or rye. Sometimes bread made from a mixture of grains and legumes that was barely recognizable as bread at all. Porridge that was essentially the same grains boiled in water until they formed a paste that would keep you alive but provide little satisfaction. Vegetables, when they appeared at all, were usually onions, leeks, and cabbage. Root vegetables like turnips and parsnips, these weren't the sweet, carefully cultivated varieties you know today. They were often bitter, tough, and difficult to digest. They were also seasonal, which meant that for months at a time, you might not see a fresh vegetable at all. Fruit was even rarer. Apples and pears if you lived in the right climate, and the harvest was good. Berries in summer, if you had time to forage for them, and if other people hadn't already stripped the bushes bare. But fruit was often seen as suspicious, something that might make you sick, and in many cases they were right. The medieval diet was so lacking in essential nutrients that deficiency diseases were common. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C, rickets from lack of vitamin D, night blindness from lack of vitamin A. People's teeth fell out not just from poor hygiene, but from malnutrition. Their bones were weak, their wounds healed slowly, their immune systems were compromised, and then there was the constant threat of famine. Not just individual hunger, but community-wide starvation that could strike without warning. A late frost could kill the grain crops. Too much rain could rot them in the fields. Too little rain could wither them before they matured. A plague of insects could devour an entire harvest in days. When famine struck, people ate things that would horrify you. Bark stripped from trees and ground into flour. Grass and weeds boiled into soup. In the worst famines, people ate leather, sawdust, anything that might provide even a few calories. There are documented cases of people eating clay, hoping it might somehow fill their stomachs. But let's step back from these extreme scenarios and focus on something more mundane, but equally challenging. Let's talk about what it would be like to try to stay clean in a world that had no concept of hygiene as we understand it. You wake up in your medieval hovel, and you're already dirtier than you've ever been in your modern life. Your hair is greasy, your skin is grimy, your clothes are stained and smelly. And this is just day one. It's only going to get worse. There's no shower, obviously. No bathtub, no running water at all. If you want to wash, you need to walk to the nearest stream, or well, assuming there is one, and assuming you're allowed to use it. You need to carry water back to your dwelling in whatever container you can find. You need to heat it over a fire if you want it warm, and fuel for fires is precious, and not to be wasted on luxury, like warm washing water. Soap, if it exists at all in your area, is harsh and expensive. It's made from animal fat and lye, and it's more likely to irritate your skin than to make you feel clean. Most people made do with cold water and rough cloths, scrubbing as best they could and accepting that true cleanliness was impossible. Your clothes would become an extension of your body in ways that would disturb you. You'd have one set of clothing, maybe two if you were fortunate. You'd wear them every day until they literally fell apart. Washing them was a major undertaking that required an entire day of work, and since you couldn't afford to have them out of service while they dried, you'd often go long periods without washing them at all. The smell would be overwhelming at first, not just your own smell, but the smell of everyone around you, all living in the same state of perpetual grubbiness. But gradually, you'd become noseblind to it, the way people who live near sewage treatment plants stop noticing the odor. It would just become the background scent of human existence. Your hair would become a tangled, greasy mass that you'd probably keep covered most of the time. Combs were luxury items, and even if you had one, trying to work through hair that hadn't been properly washed in months would be a painful, time-consuming process. But perhaps even more challenging than the physical discomfort would be the mental adjustment to a world where privacy simply didn't exist. You think you value your privacy now, but you have no idea how much until you imagine living without it completely. Medieval houses for most people were single rooms, one room where entire families lived, ate, slept, worked, and died. There were no walls between different activities, no separate spaces for different functions. You'd sleep next to your parents, your siblings, your grandparents, possibly your cousins and in-laws, all in the same space. There would be no such thing as private conversation. Everything you said would be heard by everyone else in the room. Every argument, every intimate moment, every bodily function would be public knowledge. The concept of personal space would be meaningless, and it wasn't just your own family. Travelers, workers, sometimes complete strangers would share your space. Hospitality was both a moral obligation and a survival necessity, which meant that your already cramped living space might regularly be filled with even more people. The sounds would be constant and inescapable. People snoring, coughing, talking, arguing, praying, working, children crying, animals making noise, the sounds of daily life happening all around you with no way to escape or find quiet. But even more psychologically challenging would be the complete absence of solitude. You would never, ever be alone. There would be no place you could go to think private thoughts, to process your emotions, to simply exist without being observed and judged by others. This lack of privacy extended beyond your living space. The entire community would know your business. Everyone would know how much money you had, what you ate for breakfast, who you talked to, where you went, what you did. Gossip wasn't entertainment. It was a form of social control, a way of enforcing community standards and punishing deviation. Your reputation would be everything, and it would be constantly under scrutiny. A single mistake, a moment of poor judgment, an unfortunate association could mark you for life. There was no moving to a new town to start over, no anonymity of city life, no way to reinvent yourself. You were who the community said you were, and that identity would follow you to your grave. As you settle deeper into your modern bed, surrounded by walls that provide actual privacy, in a room that belongs to you alone, take a moment to appreciate the miracle of solitude, the ability to be alone with your thoughts, to have private conversations, to exist without constant observation and judgment. Think about the luxury of being able to close a door, to have a space that is yours alone, to control who enters your personal domain and when. These aren't just conveniences. They're fundamental aspects of human dignity that most people throughout history have never experienced. Medieval people weren't less human than we are, but they lived in a world that offered very little space for individual expression or personal growth. Your identity was determined by your birth, your community, your social position, and the narrow range of roles available to someone of your class and gender. Which brings us to another aspect of medieval life that would challenge everything you believe about personal freedom and individual choice. Let's talk about what it meant to be locked into a social position that you could never escape, no matter how talented, ambitious, or hardworking you might be. In medieval Europe, the concept of social mobility that we take for granted today was not just difficult, it was virtually impossible and often illegal. You weren't born into a world of opportunity where your talents and efforts could theoretically take you anywhere. You were born into a rigid caste system, as fixed and immutable as the stones in a cathedral wall. If you were born a serf, you died a serf. If your father was a blacksmith, you would be a blacksmith. Assuming you survived long enough to learn the trade, if your mother was a servant, that was likely your destiny too. The idea that you could choose your own path, pursue your interests, or better your circumstances through education and hard work would have been as foreign and impossible as the idea of flying to the moon. This wasn't just social convention. It was law. enforced by both church and state, backed by the threat of violence, and justified by elaborate theological arguments about God's divine plan for human society. The social order wasn't seen as something that could or should be changed. It was viewed as a reflection of cosmic truth, as natural and inevitable as the changing of the seasons. Let's say you were born a peasant farmer. You would spend your entire life working land that you would never own, growing food that you would barely get to taste, creating wealth that you would never enjoy. You couldn't leave your lord's estate without permission. You couldn't marry without approval. You couldn't learn to read or write because literacy was reserved for the clergy and nobility. Your children would automatically inherit your social position and your obligations. They would be bound to the same land, subject to the same lord, trapped in the same cycle of poverty and powerlessness that had defined your life. There was no escape, no appeal, no hope of advancement through merit or effort. But perhaps even more psychologically devastating would be the way this system was presented to you as morally correct and divinely ordained. You weren't just told that you couldn't rise above your station. You were told that wanting to rise above your station was sinful, that accepting your lot with gratitude and humility was your path to salvation. The church taught that earthly suffering was good for the soul, that poverty was a blessing, that questioning your social position was questioning God Himself. You were expected to be grateful for your misery, to see your hardships as opportunities for spiritual growth, to find joy in your servitude. This wasn't just about economic inequality. It was about the complete absence of personal agency, the total negation of individual will and desire. You couldn't choose where to live, what to do for work, whom to marry, how to raise your children, or even how to spend the few hours of daylight that weren't consumed by backbreaking labor. Your entire existence would be dictated by others. Your Lord would decide what crops you planted and when you planted them. The church would decide what you believed and how you worshipped. Your family would decide whom you married and how you lived. You would have no more control over your destiny than a draft animal, and you would be valued about as much. Even your thoughts wouldn't truly be your own. In a world where everyone around you accepted these conditions as natural and necessary, where questioning the social order was literally unthinkable, you would gradually internalize these limitations. You would stop dreaming of something better because dreaming itself would become too painful. And yet, as you lie in your comfortable bed with unlimited access to information, education, and opportunities that medieval people couldn't even imagine, it's worth remembering that they found ways to create meaning and purpose within these harsh constraints. They developed rich traditions of storytelling, music, and art. They formed deep community bonds. They found ways to celebrate and find joy even in the midst of hardship. But their resilience came at a cost that you would find unbearable. It required accepting limitations that would crush your spirit, surrendering dreams that define who you are, and finding peace with an existence that offered no hope of improvement or escape. Now let's shift our focus to something that would challenge you in ways you've probably never considered. Let's talk about what it would mean to live in a world where the very concept of accurate information didn't exist, where everything you thought you knew about the world would be filtered through superstition, folklore, and beliefs that would seem absurd to your modern mind. Medieval people lived in a universe that operated according to completely different rules than the one you understand. They didn't know about germs or gravity, or the solar system or evolution, or any of the basic scientific principles that form the foundation of your worldview. Instead, they explained natural phenomena through a complex mixture of religious doctrine, ancient philosophy, folk wisdom, and pure imagination. Disease wasn't caused by bacteria or viruses. It was caused by bad air or sinful behavior or an imbalance of bodily humors or God's displeasure with your community. The cure might be prayer or bloodletting or consuming various herbal concoctions that would do more harm than good. Weather wasn't the result of atmospheric pressure and temperature differentials. It was controlled by divine will, influenced by the movement of celestial bodies, or manipulated by witches and demons. A drought might be blamed on the moral failings of the local population, and the solution would be more prayer and penance rather than better agricultural techniques. The Earth wasn't a planet orbiting the sun in a vast universe filled with other stars and galaxies. It was the center of creation, with the heavens literally revolving around human affairs. The stars weren't distant suns, but tiny lights embedded in crystalline spheres, and their positions determined your personality, your fate, and your compatibility with potential marriage partners. History wasn't a record of human development and social change. It was a story of decline from a perfect past, moving inevitably toward an apocalyptic future. The Golden Age was behind humanity, not ahead of it. The best you could hope for was to delay the inevitable end times through proper religious observance. Your medieval worldview would be fundamentally pessimistic in ways that would be psychologically crushing. You wouldn't believe in progress, in the possibility of improving conditions, in humanity's ability to solve problems through reason and effort. Instead, you would see the world as a fallen place, corrupted by sin, destined for destruction, where suffering was inevitable and improvement was impossible. This would affect how you thought about everything. Why try to innovate or invent new solutions when you believed that all knowledge worth having had already been revealed in ancient texts? Why work to improve social conditions when you believed that earthly life was just a brief test before the real existence began in the afterlife? Why question established authorities when you believed they had been placed in power by divine will? You would live in a world where the most important questions had already been answered by people who lived hundreds or thousands of years ago, where curiosity was seen as dangerous, where challenging accepted wisdom was not just foolish, but sinful. But perhaps most disorienting would be living in a world where the boundary between the natural and supernatural was completely permeable. You would genuinely believe that miracles happened regularly, that saints intervened in daily affairs, that demons could possess people and cause illness or misfortune, that prayers and rituals could literally change physical reality. You would live in constant awareness of invisible forces affecting your life. Every decision would be made with consideration of how it might anger or please various spiritual entities. Every misfortune would be interpreted as punishment for sin or attack by evil forces. Every stroke of good luck would be seen as divine favor that needed to be maintained through proper behavior. This wouldn't be abstract theology to you. It would be practical, everyday reality that influenced how you planted crops, when you got married, what medicines you took when you were sick, and how you interpreted every event in your life. The psychological stress of living in such an unpredictable, supernatural universe would be enormous. You would never feel truly safe because invisible enemies could strike at any time. You would never feel truly in control because your fate was determined by forces you couldn't see, understand, or reliably influence. And yet, as you sink deeper into the rational comfort of your modern world, there's something almost enviable about the certainty medieval people felt about their place in the cosmos. They might have been wrong about almost everything, but they were absolutely confident in their beliefs. They knew why they existed, what their purpose was, and what awaited them after death. You live in a world with vastly more accurate information about physical reality, but also with vastly more uncertainty about meaning, purpose, and ultimate truth. Medieval people might have lived in ignorance, but they died without existential doubt. Their world was smaller but more comprehensible, harsher but more predictable, limited but more meaningful. They faced enormous challenges, but they faced them with absolute faith in a cosmic order that gave significance to their suffering and hope for eventual redemption. As you drift toward sleep in your climate-controlled room, surrounded by the gentle hum of technology that medieval people would have considered miraculous, consider the strange trade-offs of human progress. We've gained comfort, knowledge, and freedom, but we've also lost the simple certainty that made even the hardest medieval life feel purposeful and worthwhile. Tonight, let yourself imagine what it would feel like to believe so completely in something larger than yourself that no earthly hardship could shake your fundamental sense of meaning and belonging, to live in a universe that was smaller but more intimate, where every sparrow that fell was noticed by a divine consciousness that cared about your fate. Because while we've been exploring the physical and social challenges of medieval life, there's one more aspect we need to examine, something that might be the most difficult adjustment of all for your modern sensibilities. Let's talk about what it would mean to live in a world where the very concept of childhood, as we understand it, simply didn't exist. Where the protective bubble we've created around young people would have been seen as not just impractical, but actively harmful to their survival. In your medieval world, children weren't precious beings to be sheltered and nurtured through years of gradual development. They were small adults who needed to become useful as quickly as possible, because every mouth to feed was a burden the family might not be able to bear. By the age of 7, you would have been working, not playing at work, not helping out occasionally when you felt like it, but actually laboring in ways that contributed meaningfully to your family's survival. If you were a peasant boy, you'd be herding animals, hauling water, gathering fuel for fires, learning to use tools that could easily maim or kill you if handled incorrectly. If you were a girl, you'd be spinning thread, tending younger children, helping with cooking and cleaning, learning the countless skills that would keep a household functioning. These weren't chores with allowances attached. These were life or death responsibilities where failure meant your family might not eat or stay warm. There was no concept of adolescence, no understanding that the teenage years required special consideration or patience. You moved directly from childhood to adulthood, usually marked by your first serious work assignment or your first arranged marriage. At 14 or 15, you might find yourself legally wed to someone you'd never met, expected to run a household and produce children immediately. The idea that young people needed time to find themselves or explore their interests would have been incomprehensible. Your interests were survival. Your identity was determined by your family's trade, your gender, and your social position. Personal fulfillment was a luxury that didn't exist in the medieval vocabulary. Education, if it happened at all, was purely practical. You learned what you needed to know to do your job, and nothing more. Reading and writing were skills reserved for the clergy and the very wealthy. Mathematics beyond basic counting was unnecessary for most people. Science, philosophy, literature, art, these were pursuits for people who had already solved the basic problem of staying alive, But perhaps most shocking to your modern sensibilities would be the casual acceptance of child mortality. Medieval parents loved their children, but they couldn't afford to become too emotionally attached too early, with infant mortality rates near 50%, and childhood diseases claiming many more before the age of 10. Emotional survival required a certain protective distance. Parents might not even give children permanent names until they were sure the child would survive their first few years. They had backup plans for replacing children who died, practical arrangements that would seem coldly calculating to modern parents, but were simply necessary adaptations to harsh demographic realities. This doesn't mean medieval parents were unfeeling monsters. Archaeological evidence shows that they grieved deeply when children died, that they created beautiful grave goods and memorial objects, that they struggled with the same heartbreak that any parent would feel. But they couldn't let that grief paralyze them, because there were other children to feed and protect, and survival demanded moving forward. The childhood you remember, with its extended period of play, learning, and gradual assumption of responsibility, was a luxury that only became possible when societies became wealthy enough to afford it. Medieval families couldn't spare the resources to maintain non-productive members for 15 or 20 years. Children needed to contribute, or the entire family might perish. This extended to every aspect of young life. There were no safety regulations protecting children from dangerous work, no child labor laws limiting their hours or the conditions they worked in, no compulsory education ensuring they learned basic skills, no juvenile justice system recognizing that young people might need different treatment than adults. If a 10-year-old committed a crime, they faced the same punishments as an adult. If they were injured at work, that was unfortunate, but not necessarily anyone's fault. If they died from preventable causes, that was God's will, rather than a failure of social policy. But let's shift our focus to something that would challenge your assumptions about human relationships and emotional life. Let's talk about what it would mean to live in a world where romantic love, as you understand it, was considered dangerous nonsense that threatened the stability of society. Medieval marriage had nothing to do with personal attraction, emotional compatibility, or individual choice. It was a business arrangement, a political alliance, an economic necessity. Families arranged marriages to consolidate property, settle debts, form alliances, or improve their social standing. The feelings of the actual people getting married were irrelevant at best, disruptive at worst. You wouldn't choose your spouse based on shared interests, physical attraction, or emotional connection. Your spouse would be chosen for you based on practical considerations like land ownership, family reputation, financial resources, and political usefulness. You might meet them for the first time at your wedding ceremony. The idea that marriage should be based on love would have been seen as absurdly impractical, like suggesting that business partnerships should be formed based on how much the partners enjoyed each other's company. Love might develop between spouses over time, and that was considered pleasant, but unnecessary. The marriage's success would be measured by how many children survived to adulthood and how much wealth the union created or preserved. This practical approach extended to every aspect of relationships. Extramarital affairs were common and often tolerated, as long as they didn't threaten the stability of property arrangements or legitimate inheritance lines. Divorce was virtually impossible, but separation was sometimes permitted for practical reasons. Women, in particular, had almost no agency in these arrangements. They were essentially property transferred from their fathers to their husbands, with no legal right to refuse a marriage. no ability to own property independently, and no recourse if their husbands treated them badly. Their value was determined by their ability to produce male heirs and manage household resources efficiently. But even more fundamentally challenging would be living in a world where the entire concept of individual happiness was seen as selfish and potentially sinful. Medieval culture emphasized duty, sacrifice, and acceptance of suffering as morally superior to the pursuit of personal satisfaction. You weren't expected to be happy. You were expected to be useful, obedient, and resigned to whatever hardships God saw fit to send you. Complaining about your circumstances was seen as pride and ingratitude. Wanting something better for yourself was seen as dangerous ambition that threatened social stability. The modern idea that everyone deserves to pursue their dreams, to seek fulfillment, to prioritize their own well-being, would have been seen as destructive individualism that put personal desires above community needs and divine will. This affected how people thought about every aspect of life. Work wasn't supposed to be satisfying or personally meaningful. It was supposed to be necessary service to your Lord, your family, and your community. Leisure wasn't a reward for hard work. It was dangerous idleness that led to sinful thoughts and behaviors. Even friendship was viewed with suspicion if it seemed to interfere with family obligations or social duties. The bonds that mattered were those created by blood, marriage, feudal obligation, and religious community. Personal affection was nice, but ultimately unimportant compared to these more serious commitments. As you lie in your comfortable bed, in a world where your personal happiness is considered important, where you're encouraged to pursue your dreams and express your authentic self, imagine what it would feel like to live in a society that viewed these aspirations as moral failings. Think about what it would mean to wake up every day knowing that your individual desires and feelings were considered irrelevant, that your highest calling was to accept whatever role had been assigned to you and perform it without complaint until you died. Medieval people found ways to create meaning and satisfaction within these constraints, but it required a complete reorientation of what they expected from life. They found purpose in service rather than achievement, meaning in acceptance rather than striving, satisfaction in fulfilling obligations rather than pursuing dreams. But perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of medieval life would be something about human dignity, personal rights, an individual we haven't discussed yet, something that would test every assumption you have worth. Let's talk about what it would mean to live in a world where your life literally belonged to someone else, where you could be bought, sold, traded, or disposed of at another person's whim. Even if you weren't technically a slave, which many people were, you would still live in a world where human beings were considered property in ways that would horrify your modern sensibilities. Serfs were bound to the land they worked, unable to leave without permission, obligated to provide labor and goods to their lords, subject to punishment for disobedience. But the concept of human ownership extended far beyond formal serfdom. Children belonged to their parents in ways that gave those parents almost unlimited power over their lives and deaths. Wives belonged to their husbands with similarly absolute authority. Servants, apprentices, and workers of all kinds existed at the pleasure of their masters, with no legal protections and no recourse against abuse. Your lord could decide to move you to different lands, change your working conditions, increase your obligations, or punish you for perceived infractions. You would have no appeal process, no rights to defend, no expectation of fair treatment. Your survival would depend entirely on maintaining the goodwill of people who had no obligation to consider your welfare. This system was justified through elaborate theological and philosophical arguments about natural hierarchy, divine order, and the necessity of subordination for social stability. You would be taught from birth that this arrangement was not just practical but morally correct, that questioning it was sinful pride, that accepting it gracefully was your path to salvation. The psychological impact of living as someone else's property would be devastating in ways that are hard for modern people to comprehend. Every decision you made would require permission. Every plan you formed would be subject to cancellation by someone else's whim. Every relationship you developed would exist only as long as your owner allowed it. You would internalize a sense of worthlessness that would affect how you thought about everything. Your thoughts, feelings, and desires would seem unimportant because you would be constantly reminded that they were unimportant. Your life would have value only insofar as it served someone else's purposes. And yet, as you drift toward sleep in a world where individual human rights are considered fundamental and inalienable, where personal freedom is seen as the foundation of human dignity, there's something to be learned from understanding how people survived and even thrived within systems of total subordination. Medieval people developed forms of resilience, community solidarity, and spiritual strength that helped them maintain their humanity even when their society denied their individual worth. They created underground networks of support, subtle forms of resistance, and rich interior lives that couldn't be controlled by their masters. They found ways to preserve hope, maintain relationships, and pass on values to their children. Even under the most oppressive circumstances, they proved that human dignity can survive even when it's not recognized or protected by law and custom. But their strength came at a cost that you would find unbearable. It required accepting degradation as normal, finding meaning in servitude, and discovering joy in circumstances that would crush your spirit. As you settle deeper into your pillow, surrounded by the security of a world that recognizes your fundamental human worth, let yourself appreciate the extraordinary historical accident that allows you to exist as a free individual with rights, choices, and the legal protection of your personal dignity. Because understanding medieval life isn't just about learning historical facts. It's about gaining perspective on the remarkable progress human societies have made in recognizing and protecting the value of individual human beings. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, secure in your freedom and dignity, remember that these aren't natural rights that have always existed. They're hard-won achievements that required centuries of struggle, sacrifice, and gradual social evolution. And perhaps that recognition will help you sleep a little more peacefully, knowing that while your modern problems are real and challenging, you face them as a free person in a world that, for all its flaws, recognizes your fundamental worth as a human being. Medieval people lived and died as property, as obligations, as functions rather than individuals. Their stories matter not because their suffering was noble, but because their humanity persisted despite systems designed to deny it. And their persistence helped create the world where you can lie down tonight as a free person, with choices they never had and dignity they never knew they deserved. So let's continue our journey deeper into this medieval world by examining something that would assault your senses in ways you've never experienced. Let's talk about what it would mean to live in a world where the very air you breathe would be a constant reminder of human suffering and degradation. You wake up in your medieval hovel, and the first thing that hits you isn't the cold or the dampness or the itching from your straw mattress. It's the smell, and this isn't just one unpleasant odor that you could eventually get used to. This is a symphony of stenches that would make your modern stomach churn with revulsion. There's the smell of unwashed bodies. Of course, dozens of people living in close quarters without soap, without hot water, without any understanding of basic hygiene. But that's just the beginning. There's the smell of rotting food, of human waste, of animal excrement, of smoke from fires that burn wet wood and produce more choking fumes than actual heat. There's the smell of infected wounds that can't be properly cleaned or treated. The smell of diseased animals that can't be separated from healthy ones. The smell of standing water that's become a breeding ground for every kind of bacteria and parasite. The smell of death, because in medieval communities, death was always present, always visible, always decomposing somewhere nearby. Your clothing would absorb these odors and become a permanent aromatic reminder of your circumstances. The wool and linen that made up your limited wardrobe would soak up smoke, sweat, urine, vomit, and every other bodily fluid until wearing them became an exercise in tolerance for your own stench. But perhaps even more disturbing than the smells would be the sounds of medieval life. You think you know what noise is because you've lived in cities with traffic and construction. But medieval noise was different. It was organic, human, and constant in ways that would drive you to distraction. There would be no escape from the sounds of other people's bodily functions, their arguments, their prayers, their work, their illness, their intimacy. Privacy was a concept that didn't exist, which meant that every sound a human body could make would be part of your daily acoustic environment. Children would cry constantly, not just from hunger or discomfort, but from illnesses and injuries that couldn't be properly treated. Adults would cough with lung diseases caused by smoke inhalation and poor air quality. Animals would make noise at all hours because they lived in the same spaces as people. And then there were the sounds of violence, which were much more common than you might expect. Not just organized warfare, but domestic disputes that turned physical, public punishments that were designed to be heard as well as seen, and the general brutality of a world where physical force was the primary means of resolving conflicts. You would hear people dying, regularly and audibly. Medieval death was rarely quick or quiet. People died slowly from diseases that caused them to cry out in pain. They died violently from accidents and attacks. They died noisily from conditions that modern medicine could easily prevent or treat. But let's shift our focus to something that would challenge your understanding of what it means to be safe in your own community. In your modern world, you probably worry about crime, but you expect your government and legal system to provide some protection. In medieval times, violence wasn't just common. It was normalized in ways that would shock you. Your medieval neighbors wouldn't hesitate to settle disputes with their fists, knives, or whatever tools they had handy. A disagreement over property boundaries might escalate to bloodshed within minutes. A perceived insult might result in a beating that left permanent injuries, and there would be no police force to call, no emergency services to rely on, no expectation that society would protect you from your fellow citizens. Justice, when it existed at all, was swift, brutal, and public. Punishments were designed not just to deter crime, but to provide entertainment for the community. Public executions were social events where people brought their families to watch criminals be hanged, beheaded, or burned alive. Lesser crimes might be punished by public humiliation, physical mutilation, or branding. Thieves might have their hands cut off. Liars might have their tongues pierced. Adulterers might be forced to parade through town naked while being pelted with garbage. These weren't aberrations or examples of unusual cruelty. This was normal, everyday justice that everyone accepted as appropriate and necessary. You would be expected not just to witness these punishments, but to approve of them, to cheer for them, to see them as moral instruction for yourself and your children. The casual acceptance of violence extended to every aspect of daily life. Parents beat their children regularly and severely for minor infractions. Masters beat their servants and apprentices as a normal part of training and discipline. Husbands beat their wives not just when they were angry, but as a recognized form of household management. Animals were treated with casual cruelty that would horrify modern animal rights activists. They were beaten, overworked, and slaughtered without any consideration for their suffering. But this wasn't because medieval people were inherently cruel. It was because they lived in a world where survival required hardness, where mercy was seen as weakness, where compassion was a luxury that few could afford. You would be expected to develop this same hardness, this same casual acceptance of violence and suffering. Your survival would depend on your ability to participate in a system that valued strength over kindness, dominance over cooperation, fear over love. But perhaps even more psychologically damaging would be living in a world where hope itself was considered dangerous. Medieval Christianity taught that earthly life was a vale of tears, a temporary punishment that had to be endured before the real life could begin in heaven. Trying to improve conditions in this world was seen as missing the point, as focusing on temporary pleasures instead of eternal salvation. This theological pessimism created a culture where innovation was discouraged, where questioning existing arrangements was sinful, where accepting suffering was virtuous. You wouldn't be encouraged to solve problems or improve conditions. You would be encouraged to bear hardships patiently and find meaning in your pain. The result was a society that was remarkably static, where technological and social progress happened extremely slowly, if at all. People lived essentially the same way their ancestors had lived centuries earlier, using the same tools, following the same customs, accepting the same limitations. This wasn't because they lacked intelligence or creativity. Medieval people were just as smart as modern people, just as capable of innovation and problem-solving. But their culture actively discouraged the kind of thinking that leads to progress. They were taught to look backward to a golden age in the past, rather than forward to a better future that could be created through human effort. As you lie in your modern bed, surrounded by the fruits of centuries of human innovation and progress, imagine what it would feel like to live in a world where improvement was not just impossible, but morally wrong. Where your highest aspiration was to accept your circumstances with grace, rather than to change them through effort and intelligence. Medieval people found profound meaning in this worldview. They developed rich spiritual traditions, created beautiful art and architecture, and formed deep community bonds based on shared acceptance of divine will. But their contentment came at the cost of progress, of individual agency, of the belief conditions for themselves and their children. Now that human beings could create better, let's explore something that would challenge your most basic assumptions about knowledge and learning. In your world, information is everywhere. You can learn about virtually any topic instantly, access the accumulated knowledge of human civilization with a few keystrokes, and choose interests you. Medieval people lived in a world where knowledge from thousands of different perspectives on any question that was scarce, controlled, and often wrong. Most people couldn't read, which meant that even if books had been available, which they weren't, they couldn't have accessed the information in them. The few books that did exist were hand-copied manuscripts that were incredibly expensive and usually owned by the church or wealthy nobles. But even the knowledge that was available was filtered through religious doctrine and ancient authorities, who were often completely incorrect about basic facts. Medical knowledge was based on theories that were not just wrong, but actively harmful. Scientific understanding was centuries behind what ancient Greeks and Romans had already figured out. You would live in a world where the most educated people believed that the earth was the center of the universe, that disease was caused by bad air or divine punishment, that women had fewer teeth than men, that heavier objects fell faster than lighter ones. These weren't fringe beliefs held by ignorant peas-learned scholars in Europe, butantes. These were the official positions of the most, perhaps even more challenging, would be living in a world where curiosity itself was seen as dangerous. Asking too many questions about how things worked was considered pride, the sin that caused Lucifer's fall from heaven. Challenging established authorities, even when they were obviously wrong, was seen as undermining the social order that God had created. You would be discouraged from thinking independently, from experimenting, from testing ideas against evidence. The proper response to any question was to consult ancient authorities or church doctrine, not to investigate for yourself. Innovation was suspicious because it suggested that the wisdom of the past was insufficient. This created a culture of intellectual stagnation where wrong ideas persisted for centuries because no one was allowed to challenge them effectively. Progress happened despite the culture rather than because of it, usually when practical necessity forced people to find solutions that worked regardless of what the authorities said. As you drift toward sleep, consider what it would mean to live in a world where your natural curiosity and desire to understand how things work would be seen as moral failings, where your questions would be met not with information but with commands to stop asking questions and accept what you've been told. Medieval people weren't less intelligent than you are, but they lived in a system that actively suppressed the kind of thinking that leads to knowledge and progress. Their minds were just as capable as yours, but they were trained to use that capacity for memorizing religious doctrine and accepting traditional wisdom rather than for independent investigation and creative problem-solving. And yet, even within these constraints, medieval people managed to preserve and transmit the knowledge they had, to create works of lasting beauty and meaning, and to lay the foundations for the intellectual revolution that would eventually transform their world into ours. Their story is a reminder that human intelligence and creativity are remarkably resilient, that even the most oppressive systems can't completely suppress the human desire to understand and improve. But it's also a reminder of how much we take for granted the intellectual freedom that allows us to question, investigate, and think independently about the world around us. As you settle into your pillows tonight, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries of human inquiry, appreciate not just the comfort of your physical circumstances, but the luxury of living in a world where curiosity is encouraged, where questions are welcome, where the pursuit of knowledge is seen as noble rather than dangerous. Because while we've been exploring the physical hardships and social constraints of medieval life, perhaps the greatest tragedy was the waste of human potential, the countless brilliant minds that were never allowed to flourish, the innovations that were never attempted, the questions that were never asked. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your climate-controlled room, with access to more information than medieval scholars could have imagined, remember that your intellectual freedom is not just a personal luxury, It's part of humanity's hard-won escape from a world where knowledge was scarce, controlled, and often wrong. And perhaps that recognition will help you appreciate not just the physical comforts of modern life, but the mental and spiritual freedoms that allow you to think, question, learn, and dream in ways that would have been impossible for most people throughout human history. The medieval understanding of time itself would disorient you in ways you can't imagine. You live in a world of precise schedules, digital clocks, and carefully planned appointments. Medieval people experience time as something fluid, approximate, and largely irrelevant to daily life. There were no clocks as you know them. Time was measured by the sun's position, the length of shadows, the ringing of church bells at irregular intervals. People didn't make appointments for specific times because specific times didn't really exist. You might agree to meet after morning prayers, or when the sun is highest, or before the evening meal, but these were rough approximations that could vary by hours. Your modern obsession with punctuality would seem bizarre to medieval people. They lived by natural rhythms rather than artificial schedules. Work began when there was enough light to see and ended when darkness made it impossible to continue. Meals happened when food was ready and people were hungry, not because a clock indicated it was time to eat. This casual relationship with time extended to every aspect of life. Festivals and religious observances were tied to natural cycles, seasonal changes, and astronomical events rather than specific dates. The concept of being late didn't exist because there was no precise moment to be late for, but this temporal flexibility came with its own form of tyranny. Without accurate timekeeping, coordinating complex activities was nearly impossible. Planning ahead was difficult when you couldn't measure the passage of days with any precision. The lack of schedules meant that inefficiency was built into every aspect of daily life. You would spend enormous amounts of time waiting for things to happen, for people to show up, for conditions to be right. The modern ability to organize your day efficiently, to maximize productivity through careful time management, would be completely impossible in a world where time itself was unmeasurable and unpredictable. But perhaps even more disorienting would be living in a world where the very concept of progress was alien. You're accustomed to thinking that tomorrow will be better than today, that next year will bring improvements over this year, that each generation will live better than the one before. This optimistic view of time as a linear progression toward improvement would have been incomprehensible to medieval minds. Medieval people believed that history was a story of decline, that the best times were in the past, and that each passing year brought humanity closer to an inevitable apocalyptic end. They looked backward to golden ages and forward to Judgment Day, but never toward a future that might be better than the present. Through human effort and innovation, this pessimistic worldview affected how they approached every challenge. Instead of asking, "How can we solve this problem?" they asked, "How did our ancestors deal with this problem? And what does God want us to learn from this suffering?" Innovation was seen as presumptuous. The idea that mere humans could improve on divine creation or ancient wisdom. The psychological impact of living without hope for progress would be crushing for your modern sensibilities. You would wake up each day knowing that your children would live essentially the same life you were living, that the problems plaguing your community would never be solved, that the hardships you endured were permanent features of the human condition. Medieval people found meaning in this cyclical, static view of existence. They developed rich traditions of acceptance, created elaborate rituals around recurring events, and found purpose in maintaining traditions rather than changing them. But their contentment required abandoning the very aspirations that drive modern life, the belief that effort and intelligence could create a better world. As you lie in your comfortable bed, the product of countless innovations and improvements accumulated over centuries, imagine what it would feel like to believe that this moment represents not progress, but decline, that the peak of human achievement lay somewhere in the distant past, and that your highest calling was to preserve rather than improve what you had inherited. Now let's examine something that would challenge your understanding of what it means to have control over your own body. In your world, you make countless decisions about your physical existence without thinking about them. When to eat, what to wear, where to go, how to spend your energy. These choices seem so basic that you probably don't even recognize them as choices. Medieval people had almost no control over their physical circumstances. Their bodies belonged to their lords, their families, their communities in ways that would seem intolerable to your modern sense of personal autonomy. You couldn't decide to leave your village, to stop working, to refuse an arranged marriage, or to pursue interests that didn't serve your social role. Your body would be a tool owned by others rather than a vessel for your own desires and decisions. You would eat what was available when it was available, not what you wanted when you wanted it. You would work until your body gave out, not until you felt tired or decided to rest. You would marry whom you were told to marry, not whom you chose to love. This lack of bodily autonomy extended to every aspect of physical existence. You couldn't choose your clothing, your hairstyle, your living arrangements, or even your daily activities. These decisions were made for you by people who owned your labor, controlled your circumstances, or had authority over your social position. The modern concept of self-care, of listening to your body's needs and responding to them appropriately, would have seemed like dangerous self-indulgence. Your body's needs were secondary to your social obligations, your family's survival, and your lord's demands. Comfort was not just unavailable, it was morally suspect. You would learn to ignore hunger, cold, pain, and exhaustion as normal parts of existence that didn't require attention or response. Your body would become something you endured rather than something you enjoyed, a burden to be carried rather than a source of pleasure or satisfaction. But perhaps most disturbing would be the complete absence of medical privacy. Every illness, injury, or physical problem would become community knowledge. There were no private consultations with doctors, no confidential medical records, no expectation that your health information would be kept secret. When you got sick, everyone would know. They would know your symptoms, your treatment, your prognosis, and your personal bodily functions. They would offer opinions, suggestions, and judgments about your condition, whether you wanted them or not. Your physical suffering would become public entertainment, a topic of gossip and speculation. The lack of effective medical treatment meant that minor problems often became major catastrophes, and major problems usually meant death. A simple infection could become a life-threatening condition. A broken bone might heal improperly and leave you permanently disabled. Dental problems could kill you through infection or malnutrition. You would live with constant low-level pain from injuries that never healed properly, illnesses that were never fully cured, and the cumulative damage of physical labor performed without proper tools or techniques. Your body would be a catalog of everything that had ever gone wrong with it, and there would be very little you could do to fix or prevent these problems. As you sink into your supportive mattress, your body cushioned and comfortable, your temperature perfectly regulated, your hunger satisfied, and your thirst quenched. Imagine what it would feel like to inhabit a body that was constantly uncomfortable, frequently in pain, and entirely outside your control. Medieval people developed remarkable resilience and acceptance in the face of physical suffering that would overwhelm most modern people. They found ways to find meaning and even joy despite bodily circumstances that we would consider intolerable. But their strength came at the cost of ever experiencing the simple pleasure of physical comfort and bodily autonomy. Now let's explore something that would challenge your assumptions about human relationships and social connections. You live in a world where you can choose your friends, your romantic partners, your social groups based on compatibility, shared interests, and personal attraction. These relationships provide emotional support, intellectual stimulation, and personal fulfillment. Medieval relationships were determined by practical necessity rather than personal preference. Your closest relationships would be with people who happen to live near you, work with you, or share your social position, not with people you actually liked or enjoyed spending time with. You couldn't choose to end relationships that weren't working. You were stuck with your neighbors, your coworkers, your extended family members, regardless of personality conflicts, differing values, or simple incompatibility. Learning to get along with people you didn't particularly like wasn't just a useful skill, it was essential for survival. Marriage, as we discussed earlier, was arranged based on practical considerations, but even friendships were shaped more by necessity than by choice. You would form bonds with the people you needed to cooperate with for work, trade, protection, and mutual aid. These relationships might develop into genuine affection over time, but they began as pragmatic alliances. The intensity of these forced relationships would be unlike anything in your modern experience. When you can't escape from people who annoy you, when you must cooperate with people you dislike, when your survival depends on maintaining harmony with individuals who irritate you, every social interaction becomes charged with tension and significance. You would develop sophisticated skills for managing conflict, suppressing personal preferences, and finding ways to work with difficult people. These abilities would be as important as any technical skills for your survival and success. But they would come at the cost of authentic self-expression and genuine intimacy. The small size of medieval communities meant that everyone knew everyone else's business in ways that would feel suffocating to your modern sensibilities. There were no strangers, no anonymous interactions, no opportunities to reinvent yourself or escape your reputation. You were known not just by your actions, but by your family history, your personal habits, your private struggles, and your most embarrassing moments. This total lack of privacy created a form of social pressure that would be psychologically crushing for most modern people. Every decision you made would be observed, discussed, and judged by people who would remember it for the rest of your life. There was no moving to a new city to start over, no changing social circles to escape past mistakes. But this intimacy also created forms of support and accountability that don't exist in modern anonymous societies. When everyone knew your situation, they also knew when you needed help. When everyone was watching your behavior, they could intervene before problems became catastrophic. The community that constrained you also protected and supported you in ways that modern individualism makes impossible. Medieval people developed deep, complex relationships that lasted entire lifetimes because they had no choice but to work through conflicts and find ways to coexist. They learned to see past surface personality differences, to appreciate the essential humanity in people they might not have chosen as friends. They created forms of intimacy and mutual dependence that provided security and meaning, even when they didn't provide personal satisfaction. As you drift toward sleep in your private room, surrounded by relationships you've chosen based on mutual attraction and shared values, imagine what it would feel like to spend your entire life negotiating complex relationships with people you didn't choose and couldn't escape from. Medieval social connections were deeper, but more constraining, more supportive, but less satisfying, more reliable, but less flexible than the relationships you're used to. They provided a different kind of fulfillment, based on duty and familiarity rather than compatibility and choice. But perhaps what would be most challenging about medieval relationships is that they required a completely different understanding of what it means to love and be loved. Love wasn't about finding someone who made you happy or fulfilled your personal needs. It was about learning to care for people regardless of whether they deserved it or returned it. About finding ways to serve others even when they couldn't or wouldn't serve you in return. This form of love was more demanding, but also more enduring than modern romantic love. It didn't depend on continued attraction, shared interests, or emotional satisfaction. It was based on commitment, duty, and the gradual development of deep understanding that comes from sharing a life with someone over many years. Medieval people experience forms of intimacy and connection that are rare in modern life. Bonds forged through shared hardship, mutual dependence, and the simple passage of time spent in close proximity. But these relationships came at the cost of individual freedom, personal choice, and the pursuit of emotional fulfillment that modern people consider essential to a meaningful life. Tonight, as you rest in the comfort of chosen relationships and personal autonomy, appreciate not just the freedom to love whom you choose, but also the luxury of believing that personal happiness and individual satisfaction are legitimate goals worth pursuing. These aren't universal human values. They're the products of specific historical circumstances that made individual choice possible and socially acceptable. Medieval people found different forms of meaning in relationships that were based on duty rather than desire, on commitment rather than compatibility, on shared necessity rather than shared interests. Their way of loving was no less real or valuable than yours, but it required a completely different understanding of what relationships were for and what they could provide. As you settle deeper into your pillows, surrounded by the gentle hum of a world that supports your individual choices and personal autonomy, let you to love freely, choose your relationships, and pursue personal happiness as yourself appreciate the remarkable historical accident that allows legitimate and worthy goals. Because while the medieval world was harsher and more constraining than yours, that provided meaning, purpose, and security in ways that modern individu, it also created forms of human connection and commitment us, that there are many ways to build meaningful relationships and create supportalism, sometimes struggles to replicate. Their story reminds of communities, even when personal choice and individual satisfaction aren't available as organizing principles. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your climate-controlled room, secure in your chosen relationships and personal autonomy, remember that love and connection are possible under any circumstances, but they take very different forms depending on the world that shapes them. Medieval people loved deeply and were loved in return, but their love was built on foundations of duty, necessity, and gradual understanding rather than attraction, compatibility, and personal fulfillment. Their world reminds us that human resilience can flourish even in the harshest circumstances, that meaning can be found even when choice is absent, and that dignity can persist even when it's not recognized or protected. But let's explore one final aspect of medieval life that would challenge everything you believe about personal identity and self-expression. In your modern world, you probably spend considerable time thinking about who you are as an individual. You have a personal style, unique interests, private thoughts, and a sense of yourself as distinct from everyone around you. Medieval people had almost no concept of individual identity as you understand it. Your sense of self would be entirely defined by your role in the community, your family relationships, your occupation, and your place in the social hierarchy. The idea of having a personal identity separate from these social functions would have been meaningless. You wouldn't have a private inner life filled with personal dreams, secret ambitions, or individual preferences. Your thoughts would be shaped by the collective beliefs of your community. Your desires would be channeled towards socially acceptable goals, and your personality would be molded to fit your assigned role. The modern obsession with authenticity, with being true to yourself, with expressing your unique personality, would have seemed like dangerous nonsense. Your highest aspiration wouldn't be to discover who you really are, but to become who your community needed you to be. This loss of individual identity would extend to the most basic aspects of personal expression. Your clothing would indicate your social position, not your personal taste. Your speech would follow rigid patterns determined by your class and education, not your individual voice. Even your facial expressions and body language would be constrained by social expectations about how people of your status should present themselves. You would have no private space where you could let down these social masks and simply be yourself. Your entire existence would be a public performance, a careful presentation of the role you'd been assigned to play. The exhaustion of maintaining this constant social persona would be overwhelming for someone accustomed to the luxury of privacy and authenticity. But perhaps even more psychologically challenging would be the complete absence of personal choice in matters that seem fundamental to identity. You couldn't choose your beliefs, your values, your goals, or your lifestyle. These were determined by your birth circumstances, your community's traditions, and the authority figures who controlled your life. The modern journey of self-discovery, of trying different things to see what fits, of gradually learning who you are and what you want from life, simply wouldn't exist. You would know from childhood exactly what your life would look like, what roles you would fill, what obligations you would have, and what limitations you would accept. This predetermined existence would eliminate many sources of modern anxiety and confusion. You wouldn't worry about making the wrong career choice, because you wouldn't have career choices. You wouldn't struggle with identity crises because your identity would be fixed and clear. You wouldn't suffer from decision fatigue because most decisions would be made for you. But this certainty would come at the cost of everything you probably consider essential to human fulfillment: the excitement of possibility, the satisfaction of personal achievement, the joy of self-expression, the growth that comes from facing choices and learning from mistakes. Medieval people found deep meaning in fulfilling their assigned roles perfectly, in serving their communities faithfully, in maintaining traditions that connected them to their ancestors and their God. They experienced forms of purpose and belonging that are rare in modern individualistic societies, but their fulfillment required surrendering the very aspirations that you probably consider most important: the desire to be unique, to make your own choices, to create your own meaning, to express your authentic self. As you lie in your comfortable bed, in a world that celebrates individual expression and personal authenticity. Imagine what it would feel like to wake up knowing that your entire identity had already been determined for you, that your highest calling was to disappear into a social role rather than to discover and express your unique self. Medieval people weren't less human than you are, but they lived in a world that had completely different ideas about what human beings were for and what they could become. They found ways to create meaningful lives within constraints that would crush your modern sense of self. But they did so by accepting limitations that you would find intolerable. The medieval understanding of human nature emphasized duty over desire, service over self-expression, conformity over creativity. These values created stable communities and enduring traditions, but they also suppress the individual potential that you consider essential to human dignity. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep surrounded by the products of countless individual innovations, creative expressions, and personal choices, appreciate not just the physical comforts of modern life, but the psychological luxury of being encouraged to discover who you are and to express that identity freely. Because while we've been exploring the harsh realities of medieval existence, perhaps the greatest tragedy was the loss of human potential. The countless individuals whose unique gifts were never discovered, whose creative impulses were never expressed, whose personal dreams were never even formed because the concept of individual possibility simply didn't exist. Medieval people created beautiful art, literature, and music despite these constraints. But imagine what they might have accomplished if they had been free to explore their full potential as individuals. Their collective achievements were remarkable, but their individual suppression was the hidden cost of their social stability. As you settle into your pillows tonight, secure in your right to be yourself, to make your own choices, and to pursue your own dreams, remember that these freedoms aren't natural rights that have always existed. They're historical achievements that required centuries of social evolution and countless individual acts of courage by people who dared to assert their personal worth against systems designed to deny it. The medieval world was built on the assumption that individual desires were less important than social stability, that personal fulfillment was less valuable than collective harmony, that human beings existed primarily to serve functions rather than to express their unique potential. Your world is built on exactly the opposite assumptions. Individual rights, personal choice, and self-expression are considered fundamental values worth protecting, even when they create social tension and uncertainty. Neither system is perfect. Medieval communities were more stable, but less innovative. Modern societies are more creative, but less cohesive. Medieval people knew their place, but couldn't choose it. Modern people can choose their direction, but often struggle to find meaning and belonging. But understanding the trade-offs involved in these different approaches to human organization can help you appreciate both the freedoms you enjoy and the responsibilities they create. Your right to individual expression comes with the obligation to use that freedom wisely. Your ability to make personal choices creates the responsibility to make choices that serve not just your own interests, but the broader human community. Medieval people served the common good by sacrificing individual desires. Modern people serve the common good by using individual freedom to create innovations, art, and solutions that benefit everyone. Both approaches have their place in human history, and both have contributed to the long story of human progress. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your private room, surrounded by the products of individual creativity and personal choice, Remember that your comfort rests on the foundation of countless medieval lives lived in service to community, tradition, and collective survival. Their sacrifices made your freedoms possible, just as your innovations may make new forms of freedom possible for future generations. The medieval world shaped the modern world through centuries of gradual change, individual rebellion, and social evolution. Understanding where we came from can help us appreciate where we are and perhaps guide us toward where we want to go. So let yourself sink deeper into your modern comfort, appreciating not just the physical ease of your circumstances, but the psychological luxury of living in a world that recognizes your individual worth, protects your personal choices, and encourages you to discover and express your authentic self. Because while medieval people found meaning and purpose within constraints that seem unbearable to modern sensibilities, their story is ultimately about human resilience, creativity, and the persistent desire for dignity and freedom that eventually transform their world into ours. Their lives mattered not because their suffering was noble, but because their humanity persisted, despite systems designed to suppress it. And their persistence, generation after generation, gradually created the world where you can lie down tonight as a free individual with choices they never had and possibilities they never imagined. The journey from their world to yours wasn't inevitable or easy. It required countless acts of courage, creativity, and defiance by people who dared to imagine that life could be different, that individuals could matter, that human potential was worth expressing even when the costs were high. Your comfortable bed tonight is the product not just of technological innovation, but of social revolution. Your freedom to choose your own path is built on the foundation of centuries of struggle for individual rights and human dignity. As you drift towards sleep, secure in freedoms that medieval people couldn't even conceptualize, remember that progress isn't automatic or permanent. The values that protect your individual dignity and personal autonomy must be maintained, defended, and passed on to future generations who may face their own challenges to human freedom and creativity. The medieval world reminds us that human societies can function in ways that seem unthinkable to modern sensibilities, but it also shows us how far we've come in recognizing and protecting human potential. Their story is part of your story, and your story will become part of the story that future generations tell about their own journey toward greater freedom, dignity, and possibility. Tonight, let yourself appreciate the extraordinary historical moment you live in, when individual choice is celebrated rather than suppressed, when personal creativity is encouraged rather than constrained, when human dignity is protected rather than denied. These aren't small achievements. They represent one of the greatest transformations in human history. And perhaps that appreciation will help you sleep more peacefully, knowing that while your problems are real and challenging, you face them as a free person in a world that recognizes your fundamental worth and potential as a unique individual. The medieval people who lived and died in circumstances that would break your spirit weren't less human than you are. They were people with the same capacity for love, creativity, and transcendence that you possess. Their tragedy wasn't that they were inferior, but that they lived in a world that couldn't recognize or nurture their full human potential. Your privilege isn't that you're superior to them, but that you live in a world that has learned, slowly and imperfectly, to value individual human beings for who they are, rather than just for what they can produce or how well they can serve predefined social functions. That recognition is the foundation of everything that makes your modern life not just more comfortable than theirs, but more human. in the deepest sense of allowing people to discover and express their authentic selves. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, comfortable and free, remember that your rest is built on the dreams of countless medieval people who never had the chance to discover who they might have become if they had lived in a world that celebrated, rather than suppressed, human individuality and potential. Their story is your story, and your story continues their long journey toward a world where every human being can live with dignity, choice, and the opportunity to express their unique gifts. In that sense, your comfortable sleep tonight is not just personal rest, but a moment of historical triumph, a brief pause in the long human journey toward freedom, creativity, and authentic self-expression. Sleep well, knowing that you are living the dreams of people who could never have imagined such freedom was possible. But now, as you settle deeper into your pillows, let's explore what might be the most psychologically devastating aspect of medieval life, something that would shatter your modern understanding of what it means to plan for the future, to hope for improvement, to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. You see, medieval people lived in a world where the concept of progress was not just absent, but actively discouraged. The idea that human beings could improve their circumstances through effort, innovation, or planning was considered not just foolish, but sinful. Pride, they called it, the same sin that cast Lucifer from heaven. Their entire worldview was built around the belief that the best times were behind them, that each passing generation was weaker and more corrupt than the last, that the world was slowly decaying toward an inevitable apocalyptic end. They looked backward to a golden age that had been lost, not forward to possibilities that could be created. This meant that when you woke up in your medieval hovel, you would know with absolute certainty that your life would be essentially identical to your parents' lives, and your children's lives would be essentially identical to yours. The same struggles, the same limitations, the same grinding poverty or back-breaking labor, generation after generation, century after century, nothing would change. The tools you used would be the same tools your grandfather had used. The diseases that killed your neighbors would be the same diseases that had killed their grandparents. The social problems that plagued your community would be the same problems that had always existed and would always exist. There was no expectation of improvement, no hope for solutions, no belief that human ingenuity could make things better. This static worldview affected how people thought about everything. When a bridge collapsed, they rebuilt it exactly the same way it had been built before, using the same materials and the same techniques that had failed. When a disease swept through the community, they responded with the same prayers and remedies that had proven ineffective countless times before. When social conflicts arose, they were resolved using the same methods that had never really worked. Innovation wasn't just discouraged, it was dangerous. Suggesting that there might be a better way to do something implied that previous generations had been wrong, that established authorities were fallible, that God's plan for human society was imperfect. These implications were not just intellectually threatening, they were spiritually heretical. You would live in a world where curiosity itself was suspect, where asking why or what if marked you as potentially dangerous to social stability. The proper response to any problem was to consult ancient authorities, follow traditional methods, and accept whatever results occurred as part of God's mysterious plan. The psychological impact of this intellectual imprisonment would be crushing for your modern mind. You're accustomed to believing that problems can be solved, that knowledge can grow, that human effort can create better conditions. You wake up each day with the assumption that progress is possible, that your children might live better lives than you do, that the future holds promise rather than just repetition. Medieval people had to find meaning and purpose in a world that offered no hope for improvement, no possibility of progress, no belief that human effort could create positive change. They developed remarkable spiritual resilience and found profound meaning in accepting their circumstances. But they did so by surrendering the very aspirations that drive modern civilization. As you lie in your comfortable bed, surrounded by the products of centuries of innovation and improvement, imagine what it would feel like to believe that this moment represents not progress, but decline, that the peak of human achievement lay somewhere in the distant past, and that your highest calling was to preserve what you had inherited rather than improve upon it. But let's shift our focus to something even more fundamental to your modern existence. Let's talk about what it would mean to live in a world where the very concept of individual privacy was not just absent, but incomprehensible. You probably don't realize how much of your daily life depends on privacy, the ability to be alone with your thoughts, to have conversations that others can't hear, to make decisions without public scrutiny, to exist in spaces that belong to you alone. These aren't just conveniences. They're essential components of your psychological well-being. Medieval people lived in a world where privacy was a luxury so rare that most people never experienced it even once in their entire lives. Your thoughts, your conversations, your bodily functions, your intimate relationships, your personal struggles, everything would be public knowledge shared by everyone in your immediate community. Your medieval house would be a single room where entire extended families lived, worked, ate, slept, argued, made love, gave birth, and died, all in the same space with no walls, no doors, no separate areas for different activities. You would literally never be alone, not for a single moment from birth to death. But it wasn't just physical privacy that would be absent. Mental and emotional privacy would be equally impossible. In a small medieval community, everyone would know your business, your history, your relationships, your failures, your secrets, your most embarrassing moments. There would be no anonymity, no fresh starts, no opportunity to reinvent yourself or escape your reputation. Every emotion you felt would be observed and analyzed by your neighbors. Every decision you made would be discussed and judged by people who had known you since childhood. Every mistake you made would be remembered and referenced for the rest of your life. You would live in a fishbowl where your entire existence was on constant display. The psychological pressure of this total transparency would be unlike anything you can imagine. Every social interaction would be performed with the knowledge that it would be observed, analyzed, and gossiped about by people who would remember every detail. You would learn to monitor your facial expressions, your tone of voice, your body language, constantly aware that any sign of emotion or reaction could become community news. But perhaps even more disturbing would be the complete absence of private thought. In a world where everyone shared the same beliefs, followed the same customs, and accepted the same authorities, even your mental life would be shaped by collective expectations. Independent thinking wouldn't just be discouraged, it would be nearly impossible to develop. You would have no quiet space to question what you'd been taught, to explore different ideas, to develop personal opinions that differed from community consensus. Your thoughts would be as public as your actions, shaped by the constant presence of others who expected you to think and feel in socially acceptable ways. The modern concept of having a rich inner life, of private contemplation, of personal growth through solitary reflection, would be meaningless in a world where solitude simply didn't exist. You would never have the opportunity to truly know yourself as distinct from your social role, because you would never be alone long enough to discover who you might be without others watching and judging. Medieval people developed forms of community connection and mutual support that are rare in modern anonymous societies, but they did so at the cost of everything you probably consider essential to individual human dignity. Their deep bonds with others came at the price of never being able to form a deep relationship with themselves as you rest in your private room, surrounded by walls that protect your solitude, with the ability to control who enters your personal space and when. Take a moment to appreciate the profound luxury of being alone with your thoughts, the capacity to exist without observation, to think without judgment, to simply be yourself without performing for others. Now let's explore something that would challenge your most basic assumptions about safety and security. In your world, you probably worry about specific risks, particular dangers that you can identify and take steps to avoid. Medieval people lived in a state of constant, generalized vulnerability, where threat could come from any direction, at any moment. Their world was dangerous in ways that would paralyze you with anxiety. Not just dangerous in the sense of higher crime rates or political instability, but dangerous in the fundamental sense that everything around them could kill them without warning, and there was very little they could do to protect themselves. The food they ate could be poisoned, spoiled, or contaminated in ways they couldn't detect. The water they drank could carry diseases that would kill them slowly and painfully. The air they breathed could be filled with smoke, disease, or toxic vapors from unknown sources. The buildings they lived in could collapse, burn, or be destroyed by weather without warning. Other people posed constant threats that went far beyond modern concerns about crime or violence. Your neighbors could accuse you of witchcraft, heresy, or any number of crimes that carried death penalties. Your lord could decide to punish you for imagined offenses, or simply because he was in a bad mood. Traveling merchants, soldiers, or bandits could arrive in your community and destroy everything you had built. Disease could strike anyone at any time, spreading through communities like wildfire and killing entire families within days. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, no understanding of how infection spread or how to prevent it. A simple cut could become a fatal infection. A common cold could develop into pneumonia that killed you. Childbirth was a death sentence that women faced multiple times throughout their lives. Weather could destroy everything you depended on for survival. A late frost could kill all your crops, leaving your family to starve through the winter. Too much rain could rot your grain stores or flood your home. Drought could turn fertile fields into dusty wastelands where nothing would grow. Storms could level buildings, kill livestock, and destroy the infrastructure that kept communities functioning. But perhaps most terrifying would be living in a world where these threats were not just possible, but probable, where most people you knew had experienced multiple catastrophes, where survival to old age was so rare that anyone who lived past 50 was considered remarkably fortunate. You would go to bed each night knowing that you might not wake up, not because of any specific illness or danger, but simply because death was such a constant presence in medieval life that it could arrive without warning or apparent cause. You would wake up each morning grateful to be alive, not as a philosophical exercise, but as a practical acknowledgement that making it through another night was an achievement worth celebrating. The constant awareness of mortality would change how you thought about everything. You couldn't plan for the future because the future was so uncertain. You couldn't invest in long-term projects because you might not live to complete them. You couldn't form deep emotional attachments because the people you cared about were likely to die young and suddenly. This proximity to death would create a form of psychological hardness that modern people rarely develop. You would learn to accept loss as normal, to expect tragedy as inevitable, to find meaning in brief moments of happiness rather than in sustained periods of security and comfort. Medieval people weren't more courageous than you are, but they lived in circumstances that required constant courage simply to continue existing. Every day was an act of defiance against a world that seemed designed to kill them. Every small pleasure was a victory against overwhelming odds. Every relationship was precious because it was so fragile. As you settle deeper into your secure environment, protected by systems of safety and security that medieval people couldn't have imagined, consider what it would mean to live without that protection, to face each day knowing that survival was never guaranteed and that safety was always temporary. Their world was brutal and unforgiving, but it also created forms of appreciation and gratitude that are rare in modern life. When every day might be your last, every sunrise becomes precious. When comfort is scarce, small pleasures become profound. When death is always near, life becomes intensely valuable. But the cost of this intensity was the constant stress of living under threat, the inability to relax or feel truly secure, the knowledge that everything you built could be destroyed at any moment by forces beyond your control. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep in your climate-controlled room, protected by modern medicine, emergency services, building codes, food safety regulations, and countless other systems designed to keep you safe, appreciate not just the physical security of your circumstances, but the psychological peace that comes from living in a world where survival is not a daily struggle. Medieval people lived with a courage and resilience that modern life rarely requires, but they paid for that strength with constant anxiety and the inability to ever feel truly safe or secure. Their world taught them to value life intensely, but it also reminded them daily that life was fragile, temporary, and could be taken away without warning or justice. Your world has traded some of that intensity for security, some of that appreciation for comfort, some of that daily courage for long-term planning and peaceful sleep. The trade-off has been worth it, but understanding what was lost in the exchange can help you appreciate both the safety you enjoy and the strength that medieval people developed in response to constant danger. As you close your eyes tonight, secure in your protected environment, remember that your peaceful rest is built on centuries of human effort to create systems that keep people safe, healthy, and secure. Your comfort is not just personal luxury. It's the culmination of humanity's long struggle to make the world less dangerous and more hospitable to human life and flourishing. Sleep well, knowing that you are living the dreams of countless medieval people who faced each night wondering if they would see another dawn, and who would have given anything for the simple security that allows you to rest without fear. But now, let's examine something that would shake your modern understanding of what it means to have a future worth planning for. Something that cuts to the very heart of why you bother getting out of bed each morning, with hope instead of dread. You see, you live in a world where tomorrow feels like possibility, where next week might bring opportunities, where next year could hold adventures, where the next decade might unfold in ways that surprise and delight you. You plan vacations months in advance, save money for retirement decades away, Invest in education that might pay off years later. Your entire life is built around the assumption that time stretches ahead of you like an open road full of potential destinations. Medieval people lived in a world where time felt like a closing trap, where tomorrow was more likely to bring disaster than opportunity, where next week might not come at all, where planning beyond the next harvest was considered foolish optimism. Their relationship with the future wasn't hope, it was dread, mixed with resignation. But it wasn't just that life was shorter, though it certainly was. It was that the future, however long it might last, offered no promise of improvement, no chance that circumstances might get better, that problems might be solved, that new possibilities might emerge. The future was just more of the same grinding struggle, only with the added burden of age, accumulated injuries, and declining strength. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that your best days were already behind you, that every passing year would bring new hardships without compensating benefits, that your children would face the same struggles you faced, but with fewer resources and more obstacles. This wasn't pessimism. It was realism in a world where decline was the only constant. Your medieval worldview would be shaped by the certainty that human history was a story of decay, that the golden age lay in the distant past, that each generation was weaker and more corrupt than the one before. The future wasn't something to anticipate with excitement. It was something to endure with as much grace as possible before the inevitable end. This affected how people thought about everything. Why innovate when the best ideas had already been discovered by ancient authorities? Why save money when the next famine or war would destroy whatever you had accumulated? Why dream of better times when improvement was impossible and hoping for it was prideful delusion? The psychological weight of living without hope for progress would be crushing for your modern sensibilities. You're accustomed to believing that effort leads to improvement, that problems can be solved, that human ingenuity can create better conditions. Medieval people had to find meaning in a world that offered no such possibilities. They developed remarkable spiritual strength by focusing on the afterlife rather than earthly improvement, by finding purpose in accepting suffering rather than alleviating it, by discovering meaning in preserving traditions rather than creating innovations. But their resilience required surrendering the very aspirations that drive modern civilization. As you sink deeper into your comfortable mattress, surrounded by evidence of centuries of human progress and innovation, try to imagine what it would feel like to believe that all of this represents not achievement, but corruption. Not progress, but decline from a more perfect past. Medieval people weren't wrong to be pessimistic about earthly improvement. In their world, most innovations failed. Most changes made things worse. Most attempts at progress led to disaster. Their skepticism about human ability to improve conditions was based on centuries of experience that confirmed their worst fears, but their acceptance of limitation, while psychologically necessary for survival, also made actual progress nearly impossible. It created a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the belief that improvement was impossible helped ensure that improvement remained impossible. Now let's explore something that would challenge your understanding of what it means to have control over your own thoughts and beliefs. In your world, you probably take intellectual freedom for granted, the ability to question ideas, to form your own opinions, to change your mind based on new evidence, to think thoughts that others might disapprove of. Medieval people lived in a world where independent thought wasn't just dangerous, it was literally unthinkable. Not because they were less intelligent than you are, but because their entire intellectual framework was designed to prevent the kind of questioning and exploration that you consider normal. From birth, they were taught that all important questions had already been answered by ancient authorities and divine revelation. The Bible contained all necessary spiritual truth. Aristotle had figured out all important natural philosophy, and the Church Fathers had resolved all significant theological disputes. Your job wasn't to think for yourself. It was to memorize and accept what wiser people had already determined. Curiosity itself was viewed with suspicion. Asking too many questions suggested pride, the sin that had caused Lucifer's fall from heaven. Wanting to understand how things worked implied that you thought you were smarter than the authorities, who had already provided explanations. Seeking new knowledge suggested that existing knowledge was insufficient, which bordered on blasphemy. You would live in a world where the most important intellectual skill wasn't critical thinking, but memorization, where the highest form of learning wasn't discovery, but repetition, where wisdom meant accepting what you'd been taught rather than questioning whether it might be wrong. The psychological impact of this intellectual imprisonment would be devastating for your modern mind. You're used to having access to multiple perspectives on any question, to being able to research topics that interest you, to forming opinions based on evidence and reasoning rather than authority and tradition. Medieval people had to find meaning and purpose in a world that offered no intellectual freedom, no opportunity for independent exploration, no possibility of discovering new truths through personal investigation. They developed rich spiritual lives and found profound meaning in accepting established wisdom. But they did so by surrendering the very intellectual curiosity that drives human progress. But perhaps even more challenging would be living in a world where your thoughts themselves were considered public property, where thinking the wrong thing was as dangerous as doing the wrong thing, where your mental life was subject to examination and judgment by authorities who had the power to punish thought crime with imprisonment, torture, or death. You couldn't just keep dangerous ideas to yourself and pretend to believe what others expected. You had to actually believe it, completely and without reservation, because doubt itself was sinful. Internal skepticism was as wrong as external rebellion. Private questioning was as dangerous as public dissent. The constant mental vigilance required to monitor your own thoughts for signs of heresy or doubt would be exhausting beyond imagination. You would learn to suppress not just dangerous ideas, but the mental processes that might lead to dangerous ideas. Curiosity, skepticism, independent reasoning, all would become psychological habits, too risky to develop. Medieval people found deep spiritual meaning in surrendering their intellectual autonomy to divine authority, in trusting that wiser beings had already provided all necessary guidance, in accepting that human reason was too limited and corrupted to discover truth independently. Their faith provided certainty and comfort that modern intellectual freedom rarely offers. But their certainty came at the cost of everything you probably consider essential to human dignity. The right to think for yourself, to question authority, to seek truth through independent investigation, to change your mind when presented with new evidence. As you rest in your private space, free to think whatever thoughts occur to you without fear of punishment or judgment. Appreciate the extraordinary luxury of intellectual freedom, the ability to question, to doubt, to explore ideas that others might find threatening or uncomfortable. Medieval people weren't less capable of independent thought than you are, but they lived in a system that made such thinking not just dangerous, but psychologically impossible. Their minds were just as powerful as yours, But they were trained to use that power for accepting rather than questioning, for preserving rather than discovering, for conforming rather than exploring. Now let's examine what might be the most psychologically devastating aspect of medieval existence, something that would shatter your modern sense of individual worth and personal dignity so completely that you might not recognize yourself after experiencing it. You live in a world built on the assumption that human beings have inherent value, that individual lives matter, that personal happiness and fulfillment are legitimate goals worth pursuing. These ideas are so fundamental to your worldview that you probably don't even recognize them as ideas. They seem like natural facts about reality. Medieval people lived in a world that operated on completely opposite assumptions. Individual human beings were considered essentially worthless, except insofar as they served larger purposes. Personal happiness was not just unimportant, it was morally suspect. Individual desires and preferences were seen as obstacles to spiritual growth and social harmony. Your worth as a person would be determined entirely by how well you fulfilled your assigned social role, how completely you submitted to legitimate authority, and how successfully you suppressed your personal wants in favor of community needs and divine will. You wouldn't matter as an individual, only as a function. This wasn't just social convention or economic necessity. It was theological doctrine backed by the full authority of the Church and enforced through both legal punishment and social ostracism. The idea that you had value simply by virtue of being human would have been considered dangerous heresy. Instead, human beings were taught that they were fallen creatures, corrupted by original sin, naturally inclined toward evil, deserving of punishment rather than happiness. Your default state was moral failure, and any good you managed to accomplish was due to divine grace rather than personal virtue or effort. This framework made individual suffering not just tolerable, but spiritually beneficial. Pain was good for your soul, hardship was character building, and accepting misery without complaint was the path to salvation. Wanting better conditions for yourself or your family wasn't just impractical, it was sinful. The psychological damage of internalizing these beliefs would be catastrophic for your modern sense of self-worth. You would learn to see your own desires as dangerous temptations, your personal happiness as selfish indulgence, your individual opinions as prideful delusions. You would develop a form of learned helplessness so complete that the idea of trying to improve your circumstances would literally not occur to you, not because you lacked intelligence or creativity, but because you had been taught so thoroughly that your individual will was worthless and dangerous, that you would suppress it completely. Medieval people found profound meaning in this self-negation, in surrendering their personal desires to serve something larger than themselves. They developed forms of spiritual strength and community connection that modern individualism rarely achieves, but their strength came at the cost of everything you probably consider essential to human dignity. The ability to value yourself as an individual, to pursue your own happiness as a legitimate goal, to believe that your personal desires and opinions matter, to see yourself as worthy of respect and consideration simply because you exist, as you lie in your comfortable bed, in a world that celebrates individual achievement and personal fulfillment. Imagine what it would feel like to believe that these very aspirations were moral failings that separated you from God and endangered your eternal soul. Medieval people weren't masochists who enjoyed suffering, but they lived in a system that made suffering meaningful and happiness suspect. They found ways to create rich, purposeful lives within frameworks that denied their individual worth, but they did so by accepting limitations that would crush your modern spirit. But let's explore one final aspect of medieval life that might be the most alien to your modern experience, something so fundamental to their worldview that understanding it requires completely reimagining what it means to be human in relationship to the cosmos. You live in a universe that is vast, ancient, and largely indifferent to human affairs. The stars are distant suns. The Earth is one small planet among billions, and human history is a brief moment in cosmic time. This perspective, while sometimes humbling, also grants you a certain freedom. Your actions matter to you and the people around you, but the universe doesn't care what you do. Medieval people lived in a universe that was small, young, and intensely focused on human moral choices. The Earth was the center of creation. Humans were the purpose for which everything else existed, and every individual action was observed and judged by cosmic forces that cared deeply about the outcome. This wasn't just religious belief, it was their understanding of physical reality. The heavens literally revolved around the Earth. The stars were lights embedded in crystalline spheres designed to influence human affairs, and natural events were direct communications from divine beings who were personally involved in every aspect of earthly existence. You would live in a universe where nothing was random, nothing was meaningless, and nothing was private. Every illness had spiritual significance. Every natural disaster carried moral lessons. Every stroke of good or bad fortune reflected divine judgment of your behavior and character. The psychological intensity of living under such constant cosmic scrutiny would be overwhelming for your modern sensibilities. Every decision you made would have eternal consequences. Every thought you thought would be observed by beings who could reward or punish you based on the content of your mental life. But this constant awareness of cosmic significance also provided forms of meaning and purpose that modern people rarely experience. Your life mattered not just to yourself and your immediate community, but to the fundamental structure of reality itself. Your choices helped determine the fate of the universe. Your moral development was essential to the cosmic order. Medieval people lived with a sense of purpose and significance that modern cosmology makes difficult to maintain. They knew why they existed, what their lives were for, and how their individual actions fit into the grand narrative of creation, fall, and redemption. But their certainty about cosmic meaning came at the cost of intellectual and emotional freedom that you take for granted. They lived in a universe that cared intensely about their choices, but left them very little room to make those choices freely. As you drift toward sleep in your climate-controlled room, surrounded by the gentle hum of technology that medieval people would have considered miraculous, consider the strange trade-offs involved in humanity's long journey from their world to yours. We've gained comfort, freedom, knowledge, and individual dignity, but we've also lost the simple certainty that made even the hardest medieval life feel cosmically significant and ultimately meaningful. Medieval people lived in a smaller universe, but one where they mattered absolutely. Modern people live in a vast cosmos where individual significance is something we must create rather than something we can assume. Neither perspective is completely satisfying. Medieval certainty came at the cost of freedom and knowledge. Modern freedom comes at the cost of certainty and cosmic significance. Understanding both can help us appreciate what we've gained and what we've lost in the long human journey toward greater comfort, knowledge, and individual liberty. Tonight, as you rest in your secure and comfortable environment, remember that your peaceful sleep is built on the dreams and struggles of countless medieval people who lived and died in circumstances that would break your modern spirit, but who found ways to create meaning, purpose, and even joy within constraints that seem unbearable to contemporary sensibilities.